The rain was going to drown someone before morning. Laura Moran knew it the way she knew the smell of her own bread rising. She had watched the sky turn the color of a bruise since noon, felt the wind change direction twice before the church bell rang for evening prayer, and heard the old well groan the way it only groaned before the worst storms found Blackthorn Village. She had told the miller's wife to bring in her washing. She had told the baker to bank his fire early. She had told old Mr. Doyle to move his goats from the low field before the creek rose and swallowed them. None of them had listened, because none of them were in the habit of listening to a woman who lived alone at the edge of the village and mended shawls and steeped herbs for her bread. So when the storm finally broke, tearing the thatch off 2 roofs and turning the lane into a river of mud, she was the only one still outside, latching her shutters against a wind that howled like something wounded, and it was then, in the middle of that howling, that she saw it. A small orange light, flickering weak and low, near the ruin of the old chapel past the last cottage. A lantern, guttering, almost gone. Everyone else in Blackthorn had bolted their doors twice over that night. Word had spread days before that men had escaped from the prison wagons on the northern road, and every stranger on a dark night was now a knife waiting to happen. Laura stood in her doorway with the rain slicing sideways across her face and told herself to go inside. Latch the door, forget the light. She did not go inside. She pulled her cloak tight, took up her own lantern, and walked out into a storm that most grown men in the village would not have faced for any price. The mud sucked at her boots. The wind tried twice to take her hood. When she reached the chapel wall, she found him lying face down in the water pooling at its base, one arm flung out as though he had been reaching for the door and never made it. She rolled him onto his back. His lips were the color of ash. His clothes, what was left of them, hung off him in soaked ribbons, and there was a wound above his eyebrow crusted with blood and rain. He did not look like a criminal to her. He looked like a man who had been running from something far worse than the law and had run out of road. She should have called for the constable. She should have left him and returned with help, the way any sensible woman would. Instead, Laura Moran knelt in the freezing mud, pressed her fingers beneath his jaw, and felt a pulse, faint, but there. Thunder rolled somewhere over the hills, close enough that she felt it in the ground beneath her knees. Rain ran in cold rivers down the back of her collar. She looked once toward the village, where every window had gone dark and every door had gone bolted, and understood, with a strange, quiet certainty, that no help was coming from that direction tonight. Whatever happened to this man from here would happen because of her, or not at all. She unpinned her own cloak, heavy and half-soaked as it was, and laid it over him anyway, because a little warmth was better than none, and because some habits ran deeper than good sense. Then she got her arms beneath his shoulders and began, inch by aching inch, to drag him toward the only light left burning in Blackthorn that night, her own. She had no way of knowing that the ruined stranger breathing against her palm was Duke Kian Pickering, the most powerful man for 100 miles, a man 3 separate parties believed to already be dead. She only knew that he was alive, and that the storm was not finished with either of them yet. Subscribe to see how the next story unfolds, and comment below where you're watching from. I would genuinely love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Blackthorn Village sat in a fold of green hills an hour's ride from the coast, small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and poor enough that most of that business involved counting coins twice before spending them. Laura Moran had lived there her whole life, in a stone cottage at the edge of the wood that had belonged to her mother before her. She earned her bread mending linens and stitching torn hems, and she earned something else, something without a proper name. By knowing which root eased a fever and which paste drew infection from a wound. Mothers came to her in the night when their children burned with sickness. Old men came to her when their joints locked with cold. She never once asked for more than they could spare, and often took nothing at all. Fear moved through small villages the way fire moved through dry grass, quietly at first, then all at once, until no one could remember exactly where the first spark had come from. In the days before the storm, the tale of the escaped prisoners had grown with every retelling, until the 3 tired, frightened men who had actually slipped their transport somewhere on the coast road had become, in the mouths of Blackthorn's frightened residents, a small army of hardened criminals lying in wait behind every hedge. Laura had heard the same story told 4 different ways in a single afternoon, and had learned long ago that fear rarely bothered checking its facts before it spread. It had cost her a husband, that generosity. 3 years earlier, the man she had been promised to had broken the match, telling anyone who would listen that he wanted a wife, not a woman who spent her evenings tending strangers for free. Laura had cried for exactly one night. Then she had gone back to her herbs and her needle and decided that if kindness made her unmarriageable, she would rather be unmarried and kind than married and hollow. The village had never quite forgiven her for not being ashamed of that choice. Laura did not mind the quiet of her own company nearly as much as her neighbors assumed she must. Her days had a rhythm to them that suited her. Rising before the sun to gather what the wood offered before the dew burned off, spending the morning bent over her needle by the window where the light was best, walking the lanes in the afternoon to check on the old and the sick, and ending each evening with a book she had read so many times the spine had gone soft as cloth. It was not the life she had once pictured for herself, back when she was young enough to picture a husband and children and a warm, crowded table. But it was a life she had built with her own 2 hands, and she had grown, slowly, to be proud of that. What she could not build for herself, no matter how carefully she planned her days, was safety from a storm that did not care whether a woman was married or not. On the night the storm came, fear was already running through Blackthorn like fever through a sickbed. 3 men had slipped free of a prison transport on the coast road, and though no one had actually seen them, everyone had a cousin who had heard from a neighbor that they were somewhere close, hungry and desperate and armed. Doors that were usually left on the latch were bolted twice. Children were kept in from the fields an hour before dusk. When the storm broke, it felt to the village like confirmation of every fear they had been nursing for a week. Laura carried the stranger home in stages, half dragging him through the mud with a strength she did not know she had, stopping twice to catch her breath under the dripping trees, praying under it that no one would step out of a doorway and see her doing something no sane woman would do on a night like this. By the time she reached her own threshold, her arms shook and her cloak was ruined, but the stranger was still breathing. She laid him by the hearth and built the fire high. She cut away the worst of his soaked shirt and found bruising along his ribs that spoke of more than a fall, the kind of bruising that came from a fist or several. The wound above his eyebrow had been made by something sharp, not stone. Whatever had happened to this man, it had not been an accident. She cleaned the wound with vinegar and pressed a poultice of yarrow against it. She worked a warm cloth over his hands and feet, and she talked to him the whole time, the way she talked to frightened animals and feverish children, low and steady, though he could not hear a word of it. His breathing stayed shallow for hours, catching now and then in a way that made her stop whatever she was doing and lean close to listen for the next one. She had sat with dying men before, in cottages up and down the valley, and she knew the particular stillness a room took on when death was deciding whether or not to visit. This room had not gone that still yet, and she intended to keep it that way through sheer stubbornness if nothing else worked. She fed the fire until the room was almost too warm to bear, packed heated stones wrapped in cloth along his sides, and refused, even in her own private thoughts, to consider the possibility that all of it might not be enough. Somewhere past midnight, his fever broke into a sweat that soaked straight through the blanket, and Laura allowed herself, for the first time since she had found him, to believe he might actually live. "You are not dying in my kitchen," she told him. "I did not carry you through that mud for nothing." Near midnight, his eyes opened. They were a deep, storm gray, and for a moment they fixed on her with a clarity that did not match a man who had nearly drowned in a ditch. His hand closed weakly around her wrist. "They must never know I survived," he said. His voice was low, cracked, but there was an edge of command in it that did not belong to a beggar. Then his eyes rolled back, and he was gone again, sunk into the deep, dreamless sleep of the truly exhausted. Laura sat back on her heels and looked at him a long moment. At the split lip, the ruined coat, the calluses on his palms that did not quite match the way he had spoken. Something about him did not add up, and Laura had learned long ago to pay close attention to things that did not add up. She banked the fire, laid a blanket over him, and did not sleep at all that night. He was 3 days recovering enough to hold a spoon without spilling it, and in all that time, He gave her nothing but silence where a name should have been. "You must be called something," Laura said on the second morning, setting a bowl of broth in front of him. "Must I? Most people are." He looked at the broth rather than at her. "Call me whatever you like." "Then I will call you Traveler," she said, "since you clearly did a great deal of it before you fell down in front of my chapel." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough that she counted it as a small victory. She was discovering, a strange and difficult patient, silent for long stretches, then suddenly sharp-tongued in a way that surprised her, as if wit were the one thing the storm had not managed to beat out of him. "You ought to be more careful who you drag out of ditches," he said, watching her stir the pot. "I could have been one of the men everyone in this village is so afraid of." "You could have," Laura agreed. "But men running from the law generally do not lie unconscious with their hands stretched toward a locked chapel door, as if they were asking to be let in rather than trying to escape out." He looked up sharply at that, something guarded moving behind his eyes, and said nothing more on the subject. She learned, too, that he did not like to be fussed over, though he tolerated her fussing with a patience that suggested he understood arguing with her would waste more energy than he currently had to spare. When she changed the dressing on his ribs, he held perfectly still and stared at the ceiling beams as though counting them, and only once did a sound escape him that was not quite a groan and not quite a laugh, when she muttered under her breath about men who fell into ditches and expected sympathy for it. "I did not fall," he said, eyes still on the ceiling. "I was thrown." "By what?" "By circumstance," he said, and would not be drawn any further than that, no matter how she prodded. What struck her most, in those first days, was the mismatch between his rags and his manner. His clothes had been fine once, she could tell from the weave, though they were ruined beyond saving now. He held his spoon the way a man holds it who was taught as a child, not the way a man learns to hold it out of hunger. He spoke of books he should not have known, once, without meaning to, before catching himself. And though his hands were roughened now, there was a place on his right hand, a faint pale band, where a ring had clearly sat for years and been recently removed. She noticed it while wrapping a fresh bandage around his knuckles, and though she said nothing of it aloud, she saw the way his fingers curled briefly inward, as though hiding the mark from her gaze, before he caught himself and let his hand rest still again. "You notice a great many things," he said quietly, watching her face rather than her hands. "It is difficult not to, in my line of work," she said. "Bodies tell the truth even when the person attached to them has decided not to. And what has my body told you so far?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "That you have carried weight you were not born carrying. That you have been struck more than once by someone who knew exactly where it would hurt most. And that whatever you lost along with that ring, it was not lost easily." He said nothing for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual dry edge. "You are a dangerous woman to convalesce in front of." "I have been told worse," she said, and returned to her work before either of them could examine the moment any further than was safe. Laura said nothing about any of it. She had learned, from years of tending secrets along with wounds, that people told you the truth on their own schedule or not at all, and that pressing too hard only closed the door faster. By the second week, he was strong enough to sit outside for short stretches, wrapped in an old blanket that had belonged to her father, watching her work in the small garden behind the cottage. He asked, once, why she grew so much more than she could possibly eat alone. "Because the widow 2 doors down cannot grow her own anymore," Laura said, not looking up from the row of beans she was tying to their stakes. "And because the Hensley boy's mother has 4 children and a husband who drinks more than he earns. And because it costs me nothing but an extra hour a week, and it means 3 fewer families go to bed hungry." "You keep a ledger of who needs what," he said. It was not quite a question. "I keep it in my head," she said. "Paper can be read by people who have no business reading it." He was quiet a long moment, turning that over. "Does anyone ever thank you for it?" "Sometimes. It is not why I do it." She glanced at him then, catching the strange, searching look on his face before he could smooth it away. "You look at me as though I have said something remarkable." "You have," he said simply, and did not explain further, though the look stayed with her long after he had gone back inside to rest. There were harder moments too. On the sixth night, a fever crept back into him without warning, and Laura sat up past dawn pressing cool cloths to his forehead and murmuring the same low, steady words she had used the first night, half certain and half desperate, that he was not allowed to die in her kitchen after she had already gone to the trouble of dragging him out of a storm. He broke the fever by sunrise, weak and pale but lucid, and the first thing he said to her, voice cracked from thirst, was a dry, "I believe you already informed me I was not permitted to die here. I am simply following instructions." She laughed despite herself, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her as much as it seemed to please him, and something between them shifted in that small, exhausted moment into something neither of them had a word for yet. He, for his part, seemed genuinely startled by her, by the fact that she read. A worn book of poetry sat on her shelf, next to jars of dried herbs, by the fact that she argued with him rather than deferring, by the fact that she had risked her own safety for a stranger the whole village had told her to leave for dead. "You do not trust easily," he said to her on the third evening, watching her hands work a needle through torn cloth. "I trust plenty," Laura said. "I simply do not trust blindly." "There is a difference. And which am I? Trusted or merely tolerated?" She considered the question longer than he expected. "Tolerated," she said finally, "with the possibility of promotion, should you continue behaving yourself." That earned her a full laugh, short and rough, as though the muscles for it had gone and used a long while. On the fourth day, 2 riders came through Blackthorn on tall, well-fed horses, asking careful questions at the tavern about a nobleman who had gone missing from the coast road, whether anyone had seen a man of a certain height, a certain bearing, last seen near the cliffs above the wreck of an overturned carriage. They offered coin for information and left none behind when the villagers, honestly, had nothing to tell them. Laura heard about it from the baker's wife the next morning, standing at her own door with flowers still on her apron, and felt a small, cold understanding settle into her stomach even before she turned to look back at the man sleeping by her fire. The woman arrived on foot the following week, dressed plainly enough that Laura mistook her at first for a farmer's wife come to trade for South. She was perhaps 50, gray-haired, with the kind of sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing and the calm bearing of someone used to running a large household. She introduced herself simply as Mrs. Amelie and asked, with careful politeness, whether Laura had by chance taken in an injured traveler in recent days. The older woman stood very straight in the doorway, rain-damp and travel-worn, but her eyes moved past Laura into the cottage with the quick, searching sweep of someone who had spent days doing exactly this at every door between here and the coast, and finding nothing each time. Laura's first instinct was to lie. Her second, watching the older woman's face carefully, was that lying would serve no one. "He is resting," Laura said. "Who is asking?" "Someone who has been searching every village within 2 days' ride," Mrs. Amelie said, "and who will weep with relief the moment she sets eyes on him, if he is who I believe he is." He was awake when Mrs. Amelie stepped through the door, and the moment his eyes found her, something in his shoulders released that Laura had not realized was held so tight. Mrs. Amelie's hand went to her mouth. She crossed the room and gripped his hand as though checking it was solid and not a trick of grief-worn eyes. "Your Grace," she breathed. "We believed you drowned." Laura stood very still by the hearth, the word grace settling over her like cold water. Later, once Mrs. Amelie had recovered herself and the man, Duke Kian Pickering, she now knew him to be, ruler of lands and tenants and fortunes far beyond anything Laura had ever imagined touching her own small life. Had been persuaded to lie back and rest, Mrs. Amelie drew Laura outside into the cool morning air and told her the rest of it, carefully, in a low voice. Mrs. Amelie's voice dropped lower as she spoke, glancing once toward the cottage window as though the walls themselves might carry the words further than she intended. There had been an attack on the coast road. His carriage had gone over the cliff edge in what the world was meant to believe was an accident, though Kian himself had told Mrs. Amelie, in a whisper, that the wheel had been cut through before it ever failed. He had climbed from the wreckage half-drowned and half-conscious and walked, or crawled, further than any injured man should have been able to, until the storm and his own blood loss had put him down in front of a ruined chapel. "Someone wants him dead," Mrs. Amelie said simply. Until we know who, it is safer for the world to keep believing they succeeded. Do you have any notion who might want such a thing? Laura asked, keeping her own voice as low as the older woman's had gone. Suspicion, Mrs. Amelie said carefully, is not the same as proof, and I have learned the hard way not to name a person until I can back the naming with something more solid than a bad feeling in my chest. But there are people close to this family who would benefit greatly from a dead duke and a confused line of succession, and I intend to watch every one of them very closely until I know which. And you want me to say nothing, Laura said. I want you to understand what you have already done without knowing it, Mrs. Amelie said, her sharp eyes softening. You saved the life of a man 3 different households in this county are quietly hoping never to see again. Whatever this village whispers about strangers and criminals, my dear, the only person in Blackthorn who behaved with any honor this past week was you. Laura did not sleep well that night either, though for entirely different reasons than before. She lay awake thinking of the ring-shaped mark on his hand, the way he had held his spoon, the careful, guarded silences, and of the way, despite everything, he had laughed at her joke about promotion from tolerated to trusted. In the room below, unseen, Kian lay awake as well, listening to the quiet movement of a woman who had never once asked what he could give her in return for saving his life, and finding that fact more unsettling and more precious than anything his own title had ever taught him to expect from another human being. In the room below, Laura had fallen into a thin, exhausted sleep near the hearth, and Kian stood over her a long moment before he left, watching the firelight move across a face that had shown him more honest concern in a handful of days than most people in his life had managed in years. He thought, briefly, of waking her to say a proper farewell, and decided against it, telling himself it was safer for her to know as little as possible about where he had gone and why. It was not until the carriage was well down the road that he admitted to himself the real reason, that he was not yet certain what he would say if she asked him to stay, and less certain still that he would have found the strength to refuse. He was gone before sunrise, carried away in a plain, unmarked carriage Mrs. Amelie had arranged under cover of darkness. He left behind no explanation, no farewell, only a folded note on Laura's kitchen table in a hand too elegant for a traveler. You gave me back my life when you owed me nothing. I do not yet know how a man repays a debt like that. I intend to find out. K. 3 weeks passed before the invitation came, carried by a rider in fine livery who caused half the village to gather at their windows simply to watch him dismount. The letter inside was addressed to Laura Moran, requesting the honor of her presence at Ashford Manor, sealed with wax stamped in a crest she did not recognize and did not need to, because by then half of Blackthorn had already worked out, through gossip and guesswork, exactly who her mysterious houseguest had been. She went, because refusing an invitation from a duke was not, practically speaking, an option available to a woman of her station, and because some stubborn, curious part of her wanted to see his face again, even knowing now what separated them. Ashford Manor was larger than anything Laura had imagined, stone and glass and gardens that seemed to run on longer than the whole of Blackthorn village put together. She stood in its entrance hall in her best dress, which she now saw clearly as plain and worn beside the tapestries around her, and felt something close to shame rise in her chest. I owe you an apology, she said, the moment Kian appeared, before he could speak first. I called you traveler. I made you eat broth from a chipped bowl. I lectured you about spoons. You saved my life, Kian said, and you did it without once bowing, which I have come to understand is a rarer gift than you might think. He would not let her apologize further. Instead, in front of Mrs. Amelie and 2 members of his household staff, he thanked her formally and publicly for pulling him from a ditch no one else in the county had thought to check, and said, plainly, that Blackthorn village and the woman who lived at its edge had shown him more honest kindness in 3 days than his own court had shown him in 3 years. Mrs. Amelie, watching Laura's discomfort at the grandeur around her, took her aside later that afternoon. Do not let this house change the shape of you, she said. He did not fall in love with a duchess in that cottage. He fell in. She paused, choosing her word with visible care. He fell in regard with a woman who treated him like a man worth saving, not a title worth flattering. Do not go changing the very thing that saved him. Laura took the words to heart, though she pushed the second half of that sentence. The word Mrs. Amelie had so carefully chosen not to say aloud. Firmly away, telling herself it was nothing more than an old woman's fondness for happy endings. He walked her through the gardens himself, waving off the footman who moved to accompany them, and pointed out, with unexpected boyish pride, the small stone bench near the fountain where he used to hide as a child whenever his tutors came looking for him. Laura found it strange and rather wonderful to see this careful, guarded man loosen by degrees the further they walked from the house. As though the manor's stone walls carried some of the weight, he never quite set down inside them. "You are different out here," she observed. "I am always myself out here," he said. "In there, I am mostly a title with a man attached to it, if the man is lucky. And which am I speaking to now?" He considered the question with more seriousness than she expected. "The man, I hope. He is considerably better company." She smiled at that, and did not tell him how much she agreed, though she suspected he already knew. Not everyone in the manor shared Mrs. Amelie's warmth. From an upper window, Lady Sienna watched the plain, dark-haired woman walk the garden path beside the Duke, laughing at something he said, and felt a cold, calculating anger settle into her chest that she had no intention of showing on her face. Lady Sienna had spent 2 years positioning herself to become Duchess of this estate, through careful visits, careful compliments, and careful patience. She had not survived that long game only to watch it collapse because a village seamstress had happened to be walking past a chapel on the right night. She did not confront Laura that day. She simply watched and waited and began, quietly, to plan. What began as gratitude became, over the following weeks, something Laura had no name for and did not entirely trust herself to examine too closely. Kian found reasons to visit Blackthorn that grew thinner and more transparent each time. Checking on a bridge repair the village council had not actually requested, inspecting a mill that had needed no inspecting in a decade, once simply passing through a village that sat nowhere near any road he might plausibly have been passing through on. Laura let him keep his excuses because she had her own, quieter reasons for not questioning them too hard. They walked the lanes together in the evenings, when the light went gold and soft over the fields. He learned the names of half the village within a month: Old Doyle and his goats, the baker's twin daughters, the miller who had once laughed off Laura's warning about the bridge and now would not stop apologizing for it. Laura learned, in turn, that the powerful, guarded man who had refused to give her his name was, underneath the title, someone who missed simple things. Bread eaten warm from the oven, arguments that had nothing to do with land or politics, a woman who told him plainly when she thought he was wrong. At the village fair that spring, he stood in line with the miller's children for a turn at the ring toss, and lost on purpose, badly, 3 times in a row, until Laura caught his eye and knew exactly what he was doing and could not stop herself from laughing at him in front of half the village. "You are meant to be dignified," she told him afterward. "Dukes do not lose at ring toss to 8-year-olds on purpose. This Duke does," he said, "when it makes a certain difficult woman laugh." Later that same afternoon, the miller, the very man who had once laughed off her warnings about the bridge, cornered Kian by the cider stall and spent a full quarter hour apologizing for his own stubbornness the previous winter, having finally connected the mysterious traveler from Laura's cottage to the man now strolling the fair beside her. Kian listened with far more patience than the miller likely deserved, and told him only that the bridge mattered more than any grudge, and that it would be seen to before the year was out. Laura, watching from a short distance away, felt something warm settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "You did not have to be kind to him," she said afterward. "He mocked me for years about that bridge." "I was not being kind to him," Kian said. "I was agreeing with a woman who has been right about nearly everything since the moment I met her. It seemed the safer position to take." There was a night, walking her home past the chapel where she had first found him, when the space between their hands narrowed to almost nothing, and neither of them moved to close it, and neither of them moved away either. Laura felt the pull of it in her chest like a held breath, and understood, with a kind of quiet terror, that whatever this was, it had stopped being simple gratitude weeks ago. "I used to think," Kian said quietly, as they stood together beneath the chapel's broken eaves, rain from earlier still dripping slow off the stone, that a man in my position could not afford to want simple things. A quiet evening. An honest argument. Someone who tells him plainly when he has behaved like a fool. And now? Laura asked, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. Now I think I have been starving for exactly those things without knowing their name, he said. And I am not entirely certain what to do with wanting them this badly. She did not answer him with words. She reached up instead and brushed a raindrop from his jaw. And for one long moment neither of them moved, caught somewhere between the life he had been born to and the life she had built with her own two hands, before the moment passed, and they walked on in a silence that said more than either of them had managed all evening. He funded the repair of the village school without ever putting his name to it, arranging the coin through Mrs. Amelie so that the credit fell to an anonymous benefactor. Laura found out anyway, because Laura found out most things eventually, and said nothing to him about it except a small, private smile that told him she knew exactly what he had done and thought better of him for trying to hide it. Not everyone watched this quiet unfolding with kindness. In the village, tongues wagged about what a duke could possibly want with a woman who mended shawls for her bread. At the manor, Lady Sienna's smile grew thinner each time Kian's absence stretched into another afternoon spent somewhere in Blackthorn, and in a locked study 2 floors above the entrance hall. A man named Morgan Holland worked quietly through account ledgers that did not belong to him, altering figures with a careful, practiced hand, and burning the pages that told the truth of where the duchy's money had actually gone. Lady Sienna had not always been cold. She had arrived at Ashford Manor years earlier as a hopeful young woman from a family with more pride than fortune, and had learned quickly that charm and careful patience could accomplish what an empty purse could not. She had spent 2 years perfecting the art of being exactly what the estate seemed to require of her, certain that persistence alone would eventually be rewarded with the title she had spent so long positioning herself to receive. Watching that plan unravel in the space of a single storm had not made her cruel so much as it had made visible a cruelty that careful patience had kept hidden until now. Lady Sienna found Laura alone in the manor gardens on a gray afternoon. Choosing her moment with the same care, she chose everything. "You must know this cannot continue," she said, without preamble, her voice pleasant and her eyes anything but. "A duke does not marry a mender of linens. He may amuse himself with one, for a season. That is different from marrying one. I have not asked him to marry me," Laura said evenly, though her pulse had picked up. "No," Lady Sienna agreed. "You have simply made yourself impossible to overlook, which is a far more dangerous kind of ambition than asking outright. At least an honest gold digger can be reasoned with." Laura held her ground, though the words landed exactly where they were aimed. "I did not save his life to gain anything from him." "How fortunate for you," Lady Sienna said, "that it worked out so well regardless." The confrontation was quiet, contained, over almost before it began, but it lodged in Laura like a splinter she could not stop worrying at. And it was only the beginning. Within days, whispers began moving through the manor and then out into the wider county. That the seamstress from Blackthorn had schemed her way into the Duke's affection, that she had somehow orchestrated the entire rescue for her own advancement, that a woman of her low station could want nothing from a man like Kian Pickering except his money and his name. A pamphlet appeared, and signed, printed with just enough truth mixed into its lies to make the whole thing sting. Morgan Holland, who had every reason to want the Duke distracted and unhappy while his ledgers stayed hidden, made certain the pamphlet found its way into exactly the right hands. Kian, buried in the sudden demands of estate business Morgan kept placing in front of him, did not learn the full scope of what was being said about Laura until it had already spread through 3 counties. Laura read the pamphlet once, alone at her kitchen table, and made herself finish every line even as her hands trembled around the paper. It named her a schemer. It suggested, in the careful, deniable language of gossip dressed as news, that she had orchestrated the entire storm rescue herself, that she had somehow known who he was from the beginning, that a woman of her station could not possibly love a man for anything beyond what his title might buy her. None of it was true, and all of it stung exactly the same. She burned the pamphlet in the hearth and did not cry until the last corner had curled to ash, and then only for as long as it took the fire to die back down. In the morning she rose at her usual hour and went about her usual work, because grief, she had learned long ago, could be carried alongside duty. It did not have to stop a person from rising. Laura bore it as long as she could. She kept working, kept tending the sick, kept her chin level in the village square, even as neighbors who had once brought her their fevers now crossed the street rather than be seen near the woman the papers called a schemer. But she watched, too, what the gossip was doing to Kian standing among his own peers, watched the careful way his allies began to distance themselves from talk of an unsuitable attachment, and made a decision she told no one about in advance. She wrote him a letter. She did not soften it. I will not be the reason your name is dragged through mud I did not choose to stand in. Whatever this has been between us, it is not worth what it is costing you. Please do not come looking for an explanation. I have already given you the only one that matters. I wanted nothing from you then, and I want nothing from you now. She left it on her kitchen table, latched her door, and was gone before dusk to stay with a cousin 2 villages over. Kian arrived that evening to find the cottage dark, the door locked, and the letter waiting for him exactly where she had left it. He read it once standing in the rain that had begun, fittingly, to fall again, and did not move from the doorstep for a long time afterward. Laura threw herself into work the way she always had, filling every hour so there would be no space left over for the ache she refused to name. She treated the sick, mended the torn, taught 2 of the village children their letters in the evenings, and told anyone who asked after her that she was perfectly well, thank you, and would they please stop asking. Kian grew colder in ways the household noticed and did not comment on aloud. He answered correspondence, approved accounts, sat through dinners with the careful, hollow politeness of a man performing a role rather than living a life. He told himself, in the quiet hours after the house had gone to sleep, that he had done the honorable thing in letting her go rather than dragging her further into a scandal not of her making. The reasoning felt sound each time he built it. It felt considerably less sound each time he caught himself staring at an empty chair at his own dinner table, half expecting a woman who mended shawls for her bread to walk in and tell him plainly that he was brooding for no good reason. He had faced down an assassin's cut wheel and a fall from a cliff without once losing his composure. He found, to his own quiet frustration, that an empty cottage in Blackthorn village had managed what neither of those things could. Mrs. Amelie watched both of them suffer their separate, stubborn griefs from opposite ends of the county and privately ran out of patience with the pair of them. Morgan Holland, believing the threat to his hidden schemes had conveniently removed itself, grew bolder. He began moving larger sums, confident that a distracted duke and a departed seamstress meant no one was watching closely enough to notice. He was wrong on that last point. 2 of the younger household staff, a groundskeeper named Ryan and a maid named Freya, had noticed months earlier that certain ledgers Morgan kept locked away never quite matched the numbers spoken of at dinner. They had said nothing, out of fear and uncertainty, until the pamphlet scandal made them angry enough on Laura's behalf to start asking careful questions of their own. Freya began copying figures late at night, working by a single candle in the pantry after the rest of the household had gone to bed, terrified each time a floorboard creaked that she had been discovered. Ryan began tracking which merchants Morgan met privately, and when, noting the pattern of a man who always seemed to travel to the coast on the same 3 days each month, always returning with ledgers that balanced a little too neatly for anyone who looked closely enough. Neither of them said a word of it to the other for weeks, each convinced they alone had noticed something wrong, until a chance conversation over the washing line revealed they had been quietly building the same case from opposite ends of the household without knowing it. We should have gone to Mrs. Amelie the moment we first suspected, Freya said, hands trembling slightly around the ledger she had copied. We should have, Ryan agreed. We did not, because we were afraid of being wrong, and afraid of what a man like Morgan Holland might do to 2 servants who accused him without proof. We are done being afraid now. There were lighter moments even in that heavy season. A groom named Toby and a kitchen girl named Libby, both hopelessly fond of Laura and increasingly exasperated with their employer's obvious misery, took it upon themselves to engineer a series of clumsy, well-meaning schemes to reunite the 2, from forged invitations to a supposed village emergency that turned out to be nothing more than a stuck cartwheel. He has not smiled properly in a fortnight, Toby muttered to Libby one evening, watching Kian pick at his dinner from the servants' hall doorway. We ought to do something. We are not qualified to do something, Libby said, even as she was already reaching for a scrap of paper and a pen. That has never once stopped us before. Their forged invitation, meant to lure Kian to Blackthorn under the pretense of a village council meeting, was discovered within the hour when he asked Mrs. Amelie a single question about it that neither Toby nor Libby had thought to prepare an answer for. Their efforts failed every time, but they made Mrs. Amelie laugh for the first time in weeks and reminded the household, in the middle of all the tension, that not everything had turned entirely grim. It was Mrs. Amelie, finally, who put an end to the standoff. She rode to Blackthorn herself, found Laura at her cousin's cottage with flour on her hands and shadows under her eyes, and sat her down at the kitchen table without waiting to be invited. You are going to hear the whole truth of this man, Mrs. Amelie said, before you decide, once and for all, whether he is worth the mud people are willing to sling at you both. And then you are going to make your choice with open eyes. Instead of running from a fight, you have already half won. Mrs. Amelie told her everything, that afternoon, in the plain, unhurried way of a woman who had decided secrecy had done enough damage already. She told Laura about the carriage wheel, cut through by someone who wanted the Duke dead and the death to look like weather and bad luck. She told her about the months Kian had spent afterward, quietly investigating his own household rather than trusting the constables, certain the danger had come from somewhere close. She told her about the years before that, too. The winters Kian had spent, unannounced and unrecognized, walking through the poorer corners of his own lands in plain clothes, leaving coin and grain at doors that never knew where it came from, because he had grown up believing that a title meant nothing if it never once touched the people living under it. He did not fall for you because you saved him, Mrs. Amelie said. Every physician in 3 counties could have saved him, given the chance. He fell for you because you treated him exactly the way he has spent his whole life trying to treat everyone else, as though he mattered simply for being a person, not for what he could give you or take from you. That is a rarer gift than you understand, and you very nearly threw it away out of pride. There was a winter, Mrs. Amelie went on, when he was barely more than a boy, that he spent 3 nights in a row walking the tenant roads in a borrowed coat, leaving sacks of grain at doors he had chosen at random, because his own father had told him once that a title was only ever as good as the hunger it prevented. He never told a single soul that story until he told me, years later, half ashamed of it, as though kindness were something to apologize for rather than something to be proud of. I have watched that boy grow into a man who still believes, somewhere underneath all the armor this house forces on him, that he is only worth what he can quietly give away. And then you came along and loved him without needing him to give you anything at all. Do you understand now why that undid him? Laura sat with that a long moment, turning it over, feeling the shape of it settle into something true. That same week, Ryan's quiet investigation broke open. A merchant he had been tracking, cornered gently and given the chance to save his own reputation, admitted that Morgan Holland had paid him, more than a year earlier, to arrange for a specific wheel on a specific carriage to fail on a specific stretch of coast road. Freya's copied ledgers, laid side by side with the household's official accounts, showed the gap Morgan had spent months disguising. The two of them brought it all to Mrs. Amelie together, hands shaking with the weight of what they had found. Laura, hearing the news, felt fear and fury move through her in equal measure. Fear for what might still happen to Kian, and fury on his behalf, that a man who had spent his life quietly trying to do right by strangers had been so thoroughly betrayed by someone inside his own walls. Mrs. Amelie caught her hand before she could leave the kitchen table entirely. The Founders' Ball is in 3 days, she said. Morgan does not yet know what we have found. If you want to see this finished properly, rather than dragged out through whispers and half-measures, that room full of witnesses may be the safest place to do it, safer than any private accusation he could later deny in a closed study with no one else to hear. Laura understood at once what she was suggesting, and felt fear and resolve settle over her in equal measure. You want me to face him in front of the entire county. I want you to finish what that storm started the night you refused to leave a stranger to die in the mud, Mrs. Amelie said. You have never once run from what frightened you before. I do not believe you intend to start now." She stopped running. She rode back to Ashford Manor that same evening, mud on her hem and her heart pounding harder than it had the night she first walked into a storm to save a stranger's life, and told Mrs. Amelie one thing before she went to find him. "I am done letting other people decide what I am allowed to want." The Founders' Ball was the largest gathering Ashford Manor held each year, and Morgan Holland had chosen it deliberately as his moment, believing that a crowded room full of witnesses would be the safest place to finish discrediting Laura for good and secure his own position before anyone thought to look too closely at his ledgers. He stood before the assembled guests and accused her outright. A fortune-seeking commoner, he called her, who had engineered her way into a dying man's gratitude and then into a duke's affections, unworthy of the room she stood in. Lady Sienna added her own quiet cruelties beside him, certain the evening would end with Laura publicly humiliated and quietly gone from their lives for good. The music had stopped. Every face in the room had turned toward her, some curious, some openly hostile, a few, Kian's chief among them, braced as though ready to step between her and the accusation the moment she gave the word. Laura felt the old, familiar urge to shrink, the same one that had once made her accept a broken engagement without argument rather than defend the kindness that had caused it. She let the urge pass through her and out the other side. She did not flinch. She had spent a lifetime being underestimated by people who mistook her quiet manner for weakness, and she had come prepared. "You have called me a fortune seeker in front of every family whose good opinion you were counting on tonight," Laura said, her voice carrying further than she expected it to in the sudden hush of the ballroom. "So let us discuss fortune and where exactly it has actually been going this past year." She laid Freya's ledgers on the table in front of the entire room, page by page, showing the gaps Morgan had spent a year disguising. A murmur moved through the crowd as the figures were read aloud, plain and damning, sums that matched no honest expense the estate had ever recorded. Ryan stepped forward and repeated, calmly and clearly, what the merchant had confessed about the carriage wheel, the payment, the date, the specific stretch of coast road chosen because it offered no witnesses and no chance of survival. Mrs. Amelie confirmed every detail with the quiet, unshakable authority of a woman who had run this household for 20 years and would not be doubted now. Morgan Holland's face had gone the color of old parchment. He opened his mouth twice to protest and found, both times, that the room had already stopped listening to him. The room, which had gathered to watch Laura fall, watched instead as Morgan Holland's carefully built lies collapsed in front of them, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for him to stand behind. He was arrested before the musicians had even finished the piece they had been playing when the accusations first began. Lady Sienna, seeing which way the room was turning, tried once to salvage her own position, insisting loudly that she had known nothing of Morgan's schemes and had only ever wanted what was best for the estate. Not a single guest in the room stepped forward to support her. Even those who had, for months, happily repeated her whispers about Laura now found urgent reasons to study their own gloves rather than meet her eye, and Lady Sienna understood, in that long and silent moment, exactly how quickly a carefully built reputation could dissolve once the room decided it no longer needed protecting. Kian crossed the floor to where Laura stood, still trembling slightly from the weight of what she had just done, and did not wait for the room to settle before he spoke. "This woman pulled me out of a ditch in a storm that would have killed me by morning," he said, loud enough for every guest to hear. "She asked for nothing in return, not then and not once in all the months since, though half this room has spent that same time inventing reasons to believe otherwise. I have met dukes and diplomats and men who spent their whole lives chasing power, and not one of them has ever shown me the kind of honesty this woman has shown me without even trying." He knelt in front of the entire gathered county and asked her to become his wife. Laura, who had walked into a storm once already for a man whose name she did not even know, found that saying yes to him now, in front of everyone, was the easiest thing she had ever done. She said it through tears she made no effort to hide, and the room that had gathered to watch her humiliation erupted instead into applause. Morgan Holland stood trial within the month and was sent away for treason and theft, The truth of the carriage will lay bare for every court record to keep. Lady Sienna, stripped of the influence she had spent years building, offered a public apology that satisfied no one entirely, but which she was made to give regardless, and retreated from society to live a far quieter life than the one she had spent so long scheming toward. Kian used what he had learned about his own blind spots to reform the running of the duchy from the ground up, opening the accounts to independent oversight and making certain no single hand could ever again quietly bleed his tenants dry without notice. Laura, once she became duchess in more than name, put her own stamp on the estate just as firmly. Free clinics for villages that had never had a physician within a day's ride, schooling for children whose families could never have afforded it, shelters built and stocked before winter rather than after the first frost claimed someone's life. Ryan and Freya were given positions of trust and comfort they had more than earned. Ryan appointed to oversee the estate's dealings with local merchants, the very role Morgan had once used to hide his own theft, and Freya raised to manage the household accounts herself, with an assistant hired specifically so she would never again have to work alone by candlelight out of fear. Both of them were given, too, a standing invitation to dine at the family table once a month, an honor neither of them had expected and both of them treasured far beyond its practical value. Toby and Libby, whose clumsy matchmaking had failed at every attempt and succeeded anyway in the end, were rewarded with a wedding of their own the following spring, one that Laura insisted on paying for personally. Mrs. Amelie stayed on as the beating heart of the household, watching the woman she had once found grieving over a kitchen table become the kind of duchess the whole county quietly agreed the land had been waiting for without knowing it. Blackthorn Village itself changed slowly but surely under its new patron's quiet attention. The bridge Laura had warned about for years was finally rebuilt properly. The school stood repaired and full, and not one family went without heat through the winter that followed. The miller, who had once laughed off her warning about the old bridge, was among the first to volunteer his own hands for the rebuilding, and never again laughed off anything Laura said about the safety of the roads he traveled. The baker's wife, who had once whispered about the seamstress and her strange house guest, brought a loaf of bread to Ashford Manor's kitchen door the week after the wedding, unasked and unpaid for, and asked only that Laura remember there had never really been any harm meant by the gossip, only fear dressed up as caution. Laura took the bread, and the apology folded inside it, with the same steady grace she had shown every stranger who had ever knocked on her door in need. Laura and Kian married on a clear morning in the same fields where he had once lost on purpose at ring toss, surrounded by villagers and household staff and every person whose life had been touched, in ways large or small, by two people who had chosen kindness over fear on a night neither of them had expected to survive. The story might have ended there, but it found its truest ending a full year later, on another stormy night, when a frightened traveler appeared at the gates of Ashford Manor, soaked through and uncertain of his welcome. The staff hesitated, unsure whether to turn him away. Laura opened the door herself. She looked at the stranger's ruined coat, the mud on his boots, the exhaustion behind his eyes, and felt the whole shape of her own story fold back around her. The traveler startled at the warmth in her voice, as though he had expected, after knocking on the gates of so grand a house, to be met with suspicion rather than welcome. Kian appeared behind her in the doorway a moment later, took one look at the scene, and simply reached for a dry blanket without needing to be asked, the way a man does when he has stood on the other side of exactly this kind of night himself. They fed the traveler at their own table that evening, the three of them talking long after the storm outside had softened into ordinary rain, and when Laura finally climbed the stairs to bed, she found herself thinking, not for the first time, that the two events of her life she was proudest of had both begun with a knock in the middle of a storm, and both times she had chosen to open the door rather than bolt it shut. "No one seeking shelter," she said, stepping aside to let him in, "will ever be turned away from this home. The greatest kingdoms are never built on power alone. They are built on the small, unglamorous decisions to help a stranger when everyone else has already turned away, and on the courage to keep choosing kindness even after the world tells you it will cost you everything." If Laura's story moved something in you, subscribe to see exactly how the rest of this world unfolds, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I would love nothing more than to say hello and find out just how far this story has traveled to reach you.